Hi everyone. In the lecture today, what I wanted to talk to you about was climate change and the low carbon economy. So I want to talk a bit about climate change in general and then how it relates to business. So the image in the background of this slide is oil barrels. So this is one of my favorite images from Chris Jordan, and it's 28,042 gallon drums, which is equivalent to the amount of oil that was consumed in the US every 2 minutes back in 2008. So what I want to talk to you about is, as I said, climate change broadly, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and what they do. A few climate change facts, so what we know about climate change, and also I will refer you to the video that's in this module from the Hadley Centre or the Met Office in the UK, which is one of the really best sources for climate change information in the world. And then also talk to you about climate change and business, and particularly the issue of mitigation and adaptation. So first, the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was established in 1988, and it's a subsidiary body of the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. So the IPCC is really a group of scientists. It reports every 5 years, and there's the reports that are coming out from the IPCC are suggesting increasingly strong evidence that climate change exists and that it's due to human activity. And that's something that we know from the science that's been put together by the IPCC. So the IPCC is a scientific body. It's not an industry or lobby group. So it's a group of scientists who get together and form a consensus on what the science is saying about climate change. And in fact, the University of Leeds, which is where I now work, and the department that I'm in has 5 of the IPCC lead authors. So essentially 5 Nobel Peace Prize winning scientists. And what they do is they combine the data that we have on climate change and come up with a consensus report. So really, what we get in the IPCC reports is the lowest common denominator. It's the science that every scientist in that group is willing to agree to. It's a consensus report. So the group does gain a voice from fossil fuel dependent countries, particularly the US and the Middle East and states, but it's not a political body, it's a scientific body, so a group of scientists, of climate scientists. So the report in 2007 involved more than 500 lead authors and 2,000 expert reviewers. So the fact that this is a consensus report really means that things could actually be worse than what the IPCC is saying. We see often this idea that there's a debate in the literature, that some scientists agree and some don't, when in fact I think it's over 90% of scientists agree on the science of climate change, that it's occurring and that it's human induced. We do get some dissenting voices, but these are mostly from political and economic conservatism. So also this idea of lobbying by the coal and oil industries. So this conflict of interest arises particularly in the dissenting voices. So there's questionable objectivity of those who are questioning the science or casting doubt on the scientific evidence. So as an example, Robin Batterham was Australia's chief scientist from 1999 to 2005, but he was also the chief technologist at Rio Tinto. So we need to question, just as we're questioning the science, and that's what scientists do, we also need to question what is the agenda of those dissenting voices. The IPCC has come under public criticism, and in 2010 there was criticism of the published reports on the melting dates of the Himalayan glaciers, as well as the use of grey literature. So grey literature is that literature that's not peer reviewed, so it hasn't been yet published in a journal. It might be a PhD student's results from their research that hasn't yet been published, or a government report, something like that. So it hasn't been through that rigorous scientific peer review process. The benefit of using that sort of literature is that the IPCC can gain the most recent findings. Often it takes a bit of time to get research published, but the grey literature, the stuff that hasn't been published, can have some data that would be valuable for the IPCC reports. But that wasn't pointed out as effectively in the IPCC reports as it could have been. So there was an independent review in 2010 by the Inter-Academy Council, and they confirmed the rigour of the IPCC reports and the evidence, but they made some recommendations. So, for example, they suggested that the grey literature be flagged more effectively and more clearly in future reports. So, what we know from climate change and what the impacts are occurring is we're having significantly altered precipitation patterns. So, more frequent heavy rain, as well as longer and more intense droughts. And this is looking at it at a global scale. We might see different impacts at a very local level. So, just as we're getting warming, we might see more severe impacts. So, it might be colder winters, warmer summers. But in general, the globe is warming. We're also seeing fewer cold days and cold nights, more frosts and more frequent hot days and hot nights and heat waves. Increases in ocean temperatures and as increase in tropical cyclone activity, as well as ocean acidification. So there's just some examples of climate change impacts, and they're not going away. So what happens then is we need to look at how this is relevant for business. So if we look at different industries, so water is hugely important. So we're seeing more water in the tropics and less water in drought and semi-arid areas. In looking at ecosystems, we're seeing coral bleaching and mortality and significant species extinctions. In terms of food production, cereal productivity is decreased in some areas but increased in others, so shifting the areas of productive land. And coastal areas, increased potential for storm damage as well as increased probability of coastal flooding. And these impacts will continue. So even if we were to halt greenhouse gas emissions at the current level or at 2007 levels even, it would be very likely that we would see these and more impacts in the future. So even if we did halt the levels, we're still going to see impacts. So organisations and societies, indeed, across the world need to adapt to climate change, and that's a given. So generally, when we look at environmental impacts or we look at the environmental literature, there's a tendency to look at how the organisation or the firm affects the natural environment and try to manage that. So all of the literature on environmental management, a lot of what we've looked at so far in the course, generally looks at the impact or trying to minimise the impact of the firm on the natural environment. When we start to think about climate change, we also need to consider the flip side. So how the natural environment and those climate change impacts are affecting the firm. So this idea of mitigation and adaptation. So we have different types of impacts too. So those direct impacts, the biophysical impacts, so the severe weather events, the droughts, the floods. But we also have indirect impacts. So the changing competitive landscape, the psychographical impacts, so the changing needs of the behaviour in stakeholders. So are stakeholders demanding something that they weren't previously? And changes in the legal environment. So the fluctuations in requirements for climate change reporting or the carbon tax are examples of legal impacts on organisations. And the uncertainty there is also important. So this idea of mitigation and adaptation is really looking at the effect on, well, it can be applied broadly, but particularly looking at the effect on business. So mitigation, we look at trying to reduce the organisation's impact on the natural environment. So in the case of climate change, the organisation reducing greenhouse gas emissions or minimising damage to the natural environment. Adaptation is the flip side, where we're looking at the effect of the environment on the organisation or the firm. So adapting to climate change impacts. It might be instead of having poles and wires above ground, putting them underground so that they're not affected by cyclones. So it's about minimising the natural environment's effect on society and the economy. So in graphical representation, when we look at the effect of the firm on the natural environment, we're looking at mitigation. So trying to reduce the organisation's impact. So looking at the focus is on the vulnerability of nature. Whereas when we look at adaptation, it's the flip side. So we're seeing outside-in effects. So where we're trying to minimise the effects of the natural environment on society and the organisation. So the vulnerability then is on the socio-economic system rather than the natural environment. So these discontinuities in climate change impacts are really important. So when we're seeing those severe weather events, it's something that the organisation needs to respond to. or shifts in where we've got productive land, again, the organisation needs to respond to that. So this idea of mitigation and adaptation really go hand in hand when we're talking about climate change impacts. And the activity that I'll get you to do in this module really covers that idea of adaptation as well as mitigation.